Hey everybody, this is Kelli Bergheimer, and I'm going to talk to you today about understanding your DNA health reports. This was a presentation that was originally given in December of 2018 for the Hamilton County and Butler County Southwest Ohio DNA Interest Group. And so this recording is a substitution for that. We couldn't get our technology to work that night, but hope you enjoy and learn something new. We're going to talk today about DNA, and when we do that, I always want to give the cautionary tale. What do you, do you want to know? Do you need to know health considerations? Do you have access to your parents and grandparents and siblings in terms of testing? What if you find out something that impacts others or possibly impacts your children or future children? And I think maybe even the biggest question is, will this change how you live your life? It's important to understand that although all of this is based on scientific research that's been done by our government and other entities in the Human Genome Project for decades, there still is a little bit of trepidation in the medical community about this, and you should always involve a professional. You might need to involve a counselor, even a genetic counselor if something is revealed that might require further testing. There are doctors and specialists that you could involve as well. And my suggestion is to always keep in mind that having a SNP associated with a disease is not the same as a medical panel test, and it is also not a diagnosis. I think it's really important to realize that the reports that you get either from 23andMe or Promethease or even some over-the-counter type DNA testing in the future is not a diagnosis. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's really important that you consider that you might need to consult someone else for more information. I think it's important to say having a SNP for associated with a certain disease is not a panel test and it's not a diagnosis. And I'm going to say it many, many times. I have an image here of what a SNP is. And a SNP is where there is a variation in the bases at a specific location. And that's something that the DNA tests will register. And it's just important to keep in mind that this is something that's interesting, it's informative, it could help you make further health decisions. It's something you should definitely talk to your doctor about, but it's not a diagnosis. We're going to talk just for a minute about chromosomes and genes and alleles. From largest to smallest, I think it's important to kind of wrap your head around what are the DNA pieces that we're talking about. A DNA molecule is made up of genes, and you can see here in the photo or in the image that there are genes that are unraveling so that you can see gene 1, gene 2, gene 3. Those are specific locations that are in each of our chromosomes. And traits like flower color, eye color, hair color, and even some particular diseases are inherited in units of DNA that are called genes. If there are alternate versions of a gene, those are called alleles. So you might have noticed if you downloaded your raw DNA kit and you actually opened the file to look at it, there's a sequence of base pairs. There's actually two separate sequences. One is the allele set that you got from your mother in one chromosome, and one is the allele set that you got from your father in another chromosome. Now, with raw DNA, it's not going to tell you which alleles you got from mom and which you got from dad. Segment analysis is the tool that we use to determine that. But just keep in mind that we do have variety in what we get from each of our parents. So sometimes that means that we will have a disease or a trait because both of our parents have an allele for that trait or a gene. Sometimes it means that we're a carrier. So maybe it's given to us in one parent, but the normal gene is dominant, and so therefore you don't inherit. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind that go back to our basic high school biology class. And it's important to also think about largest to smallest. The human genome has 23 pair of chromosomes, one of each chromosome from each parent. Genes are the units of the DNA in a location on that chromosome, and alleles are the variations that are inherited from our parents. That's kind of a big to small look. So what is the human genome? We're going to talk about this because I think for the larger picture, it's important to understand how this has been studied, what led us to today. And in order to understand that, we have to talk about what's the human genome. And I have an illustration here of blueprints for different kinds of homes. So if we look at these, what do these blueprints have in common? These could be typical homes all around the country. So if you look at them, what do they all have in common? They have pitched roofs, they have windows, doors, foundations. Um, there are things structurally that all of the homes have. And the DNA and our genome as a human is the same way. We have structural things that are all in common. So, for example, the genes that make us stand upright or build our digestive system or allow us to have two ears and two eyes or have bilateral symmetry, those are all genes that we have in common as human beings. And so our DNA testing companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, Living DNA, MyHeritage, those companies are not testing all of our genome. They're not doing full sequencing of our genome because the vast majority of our genome we have in common. And they're for common things that we all share as mammals and as humans. So our DNA testing company are looking for those places where we're different. The Human Genome Project started around 1990, and scientists for our government and others set out to map the entire human genome sequence. They have completed it in 2003. Of course, there's still ongoing study anytime a variant is found, but our government has spent a lot of time and effort and energy and research dollars on the Human Genome Project. And as a result, we have affordable DNA testing. We have affordable DNA testing for health and for panel tests for certain diseases, but we also have affordable testing for what we love, which is genealogy. So we can thank our government for that. But what it also means when the government funds something is that everything is available to us through Freedom of Information Act. So we have access to so many of the studies and research and all sorts of presentations and diagrams and things that have been made as a result of that study. And those, actually many studies over many years. So we'll point to some of those so you can investigate more yourself. In 1990, the BRCA gene for breast cancer was mapped. There are some others that showed up in the mid to late 1990s. The full sequence of the influenza vaccine was mapped, or I'm sorry, the influenza bacteria was mapped. Yeast was mapped. Mouse genome was mapped. E. coli genome, and also chromosome 22. That all happened early in the process and then in the mid to late 90s. Part of the reason why animals and bacteria and other sorts of living beings were sequenced is because they're used in research. So scientists were looking for places where the human genome and other mammals and other species have similarities. So just something to keep in mind. It was the Human Genome Project, but they did map other species as well. So what was the goal? The goal was to find the complete sequence of about 3 billion base pairs in humans. And just to put that in perspective, That's 3 billion base pairs in one cell that has one nucleus with one set of 23 chromosomes. So that's a lot in a small space. And if you know about most of the testing companies that we have access to now for genealogical DNA tests, you're testing around 700,000 markers. So of the 3 billion that are in humans. So it's just something to keep in mind, those numbers. Um, this Human Genome Project identified 20 to 25,000 genes that are in humans. They found the complete sequence of many other species, a lot of them research animals or bacteria or other things that impact human health. And they identified genes that are critical for life. So if something goes wrong, what might cause a spontaneous miscarriage? Also, they identified functions of particular genes to the extent that they could at the time. And that research is still ongoing even today. If you have an account at 23andMe and you've set the notifications, you probably are getting regular updates. This has just been uncovered. This has just been discovered. A gene sequence for this has been revealed. So it's important to also kind of keep up with your results that you receive because they're not static. They will change over time as the science refines and improves. So it is something to look at your results quite often or set the notifications so that you receive results. 23andMe also allows people to do what I call citizen science, where you can actually contribute to what they're doing. And you can answer questionnaires and surveys. You might get a survey that says, you have rosacea, which I do. And then it says, would you like to answer questions about rosacea? And so then there's a series of questions that helps them. There are also some other more generic studies going on with regards to exercise, sleep, some of those other things. So it's always good to kind of keep up with that if you're interested in contributing to what could be the next round of information received. As anything with DNA testing, you have all sorts of opting out. You can opt out, you can delete your kits, you can remove yourself from the databases, you can opt out of those notifications. But if you're interested in being in some of those, look in your settings and set those accordingly so that you can participate if you want to. On this diagram, I know it's tough to see because the type is really small, but the link is here and it's in the handout that Kathy will attach to this presentation. This is just a diagram from one of the .gov sites, so it's a public information site, of all the different diseases, conditions, traits, and things that have been located on chromosome number 4. You can go online and you can look at what's been identified at every chromosome. I just picked 4 kind of randomly, but what you'll see here, if you look at it online and kind of blow it up a little larger, you'll see 2 different kinds of leukemia. Mast cell leukemia and acute myeloid leukemia are noted on chromosome number 4. Also, 2 different kinds of Parkinson's have been studied and identified at certain regions on chromosome number 4. Hair color red is on chromosome number 4. It's also important to point out that many different traits, eye color, hair color, are called multiple allele traits. And so there might be multiple genes involved in that. So it's not necessarily true that everyone who has the gene for hair color red on chromosome 4 has red hair. There are other factors that play into that. There are some health testing options with your raw DNA results. So let's talk about 23andMe and Promethease. So we'll start with 23andMe. Their site, if you take their test, you have a couple of options. You can do their lower cost test and just have ancestry results. So ethnicity, matching, that sort of thing. Or you can pay an additional fee and you can have health testing thrown in the mix. There are rates that are associated with that right now, the ancestry testing is usually around $99, and the health and ancestry combination is closer to $199. Sometimes they have sales, so if you're thinking about doing a health test there, definitely follow them online, see if you can find where there's a sale. Um, Sometimes Kathy with the DNA interest group will email about sales that are going on. I know that in Columbus and Central Ohio group, I email sales that are going on. So get added to one of our email distribution lists. Um, there are some things that you'll find out at 23andMe. There is a section called genetic health risks. So you can learn how genetics influence your risk for certain diseases. So that's an interesting tab. Again, there's an asterisk there, and the asterisk being this is not a diagnostic test, and we'll say it again, it is not replacing a doctor. You can also find your ancestry results, so you'll find where your DNA came from. There's ethnicity results that I believe just recently were updated in December sometime or early January. And they've added a lot more reference populations to their database. So again, if you have a 23andMe test and you haven't checked your ethnicity chart for a while, you might want to take a peek at that. There are some interesting studies that have been happening over the last couple of decades about wellness. And wellness is categorized more like choices that you can make that influence your health. So how well do you sleep, and can you make changes to sleep better? What about caffeine, exercise, tendency to gain or lose weight? You know, things like that kind of fall under the wellness category. And I'll show you my results in a bit. And we'll look at where some things were a little off and some things were pretty close. Carrier status is another thing we're going to talk about today. If you're thinking about starting a family or you have children, you can find out some information about carrier status. But I would also say that if you are concerned about passing on a particular genetic disorder or disease that's in your family, you would definitely want to go to a genetic counselor and have a full panel of tests. It's not something that 23andMe should be informing your decision. You can also find out about traits. So features, taste, hair color, eye color, things like that. Those are considered to be inheritable traits. So you'll find all those things in your 23andMe results if you purchase the full testing package. In order to use Promethease, another company, you would need to upload a result there. So you can upload your raw DNA from any of the testing companies. Let's say you have an Ancestry account. You can go to Settings. You can download your raw DNA from there. What will load to your computer is a zip file. You do not want to open it. You want to upload it right away to Promethease. A lot of you are familiar with this because you've probably uploaded your raw DNA already to GEDmatch or DNA Painter or another third-party tool. So it's the same process for Promethease. And then what you'll get is an email with results. Where is your health report? So we're going to look at that. How do you find your 23andMe health report? Well, you can print a summary of it. You can invite people to look at it. So let's say you want to share that with your parents or your children. And on screen, you can see kind of what the current screen looks like, where you can print the report summary if you want. That'd be a good thing to do to take to your doctor. And also to take to other specialists if you want to discuss the results. You might have mixed results talking to a specialist or doctor about it. I know that with my general doctor, my internal medicine doctor, I just challenged her to take the test herself. I said, I'm going to do this DNA health test. I think you should do it too, so we could talk about it. And the next year when I went back for my yearly exam, I talked to her about it, and she had actually done her tests. and both of us had our reports printed. So it was just kind of an interesting bonding moment between me and my physician. But I think it's important that sometimes we educate our specialists and doctors what's out there. And I'll talk in a minute about a couple of things that I've done since then with my DNA health reports. You can see here, there's reports here. You can view all the reports. So the first one is about genetic weight, bitter taste, cheek dimples, cleft chin. So there's a lot of things in there that have to do with traits. There are also health risks and carrier status. You can see that there are 42 reports under carrier status, 7 reports under genetic health risk, and that sort of thing. So you can kind of tab your way through that, or you can print a complete report summary. The nice thing about 23andMe's interface is that as new information is added, you'll receive an email if you have the notification set for that, and you'll know that there's been an update to the health reports. So that's always a nice feature, that they'll let you know that something's been changed. Autosomal DNA is a small sample of each of the 22 pairs of chromosomes, and also the X chromosome is thrown in there as well. And we have, as I mentioned earlier, about 700,000 locations are tested among the 3.2 billion base pairs. And variants are where our DNA differ. Variants give us different traits and different risk factors. So depending on what alleles and variants we have, we're going to have different risk factors for different diseases, and they also give us different traits. I just want to point out, this is a common thing that people ask me about when you talk about siblings. When I first mentioned health testing, and I had in that list that you might want to consider having siblings do health testing as well. Remember, as children of our parents, we receive half of our mom and half of our dad's DNA, but siblings can receive different halves. So we each get kind of a different scramble of mom and dad, and so sometimes things appear in one sibling versus another. So for example, if I take a DNA test for health and I look at my results, my siblings might have different results and different areas of concern, different traits, depending on what they possibly inherited from their mother and same mother and father. So it's important to keep in mind that just because you've had a health report that says a certain number of things, it doesn't necessarily mean that your siblings will have the same health report. Of course, identical twins and triplets would be the exception to that. But each child has half their DNA from mom and dad, but you have a different scramble in each sibling combination. That's also why your ethnicity charts could be different among siblings, and often are different among siblings. So how do you find your Promethease health report? Um, Old school, about a year ago, it came as a spreadsheet. And so this is just a screenshot of the spreadsheet for those of you who ran the test back then and you weren't really sure what it meant. This is what it looks like. Their interface is a little bit different now, a lot more user-friendly. But this is the raw data that is the information involved in your health report. And I thought it was important to still show this because even though new interfaces happen, you know, this is based on scientific research. It's also based on sorting in terms of kind of most impactful to least impactful, just like our cousin matches are sorted from closest matches to furthest away matches. So I just want to show you this. You can see that the first thing on the list is that I'm female. So that was correct. The next thing that shows up is that I have a problem metabolizing NSAIDs, and that's true. They just don't work for me. The next thing listed there is blue eyes are much more likely. It is true that blue eyes are more likely given the fact that my father has blue eyes and blue eyes are dominant. My mom has green eyes and I actually have green eyes, so it's a mutation or a variant. I should have blue eyes, technically, according to DNA. I have, if you read here, a higher, 39% higher risk for colorectal cancer correlated with the consumption of processed meats. So there's a really good thing health-wise, wellness-wise, to know about yourself, that you don't necessarily have a high risk of colon cancer, but an environmental trigger such as processed meats, sodium nitrites and preservatives and things that are in processed meats might be a trigger for developing colorectal cancer. It also might help your physician determine how often you should have colonoscopy screenings. So when I took this result to my physician when I was 50, she suggested this would be a good year to do a baseline. And then she also recommended normally you would have a test about every 10 years. And she recommended that I do a test every 5 years. Now, I do not eat processed meats, lunch meat, bacon, ham, things like that. I really don't eat or don't eat very much of it all. So I kind of have an aversion to it anyway, and I've not really eaten much of it through my life. But it is something to know if you're in a higher risk category based on what you're eating. There are some other things here that are interesting. Lower heart attack risk than average. Even though I would consider myself to be overweight, most doctors would consider me to be overweight. I do, as a family history, on both sides of my family, have a much lower heart attack risk. People tend to live a really long time. We're just kind of chubby people that live a long time. So for whatever that's worth, I'll take that trade-off. Um, you can see sometimes I've highlighted here in yellow, miscall, likely miscall if from ancestry data. There are some things that show up depending on which testing company you upload to Promethease that are miscalls. So what it means technically is that it's not something to be very concerned about because it's probably an error in the reading of the code. So that's something that you can certainly learn more about if you want to, and there are white papers and other things associated where you can learn about that. Again, there's increased risk for type 2 diabetes. There isn't a family history of that, to my knowledge, in any of my lines that tend to live forever. But it doesn't mean it's not a risk for me based on, again, maybe diet or exercise or some of those other considerations. And then I have here poor metabolizer of several popular medicines. It is very true that I am a very poor metabolizer of medicine. On the flip side, I have a very high pain tolerance. So oftentimes I don't need um, medicine. So it's just something that's interesting that kind of verified what I already knew about myself. There were some things that I recognized, and I'm just going to point out a couple things here. The first thing I have in yellow is stronger cravings for alcohol. Um, my family, some members of my family do have addiction issues. Um, I also think that there's a compulsion, an OCD kind of component to that, a compulsiveness. And so we do in our family tend to be high achieving type A OCD types. So just something to keep in mind. But I do have several in my family who have been through recovery. So I know that that's a real thing, and it is something that I knew as a young parent to reinforce to my children as they were growing up that this is a risk for you. We have a tendency toward that. And that was long before I had a DNA test to show me that I do actually have a genetic link there. Also, significantly increased risk for substance use disorders. Again, yes, I would say that is very true in my family. Um, I have a 1.16 times increased risk of osteoarthritis. I actually do have osteoarthritis. I've had it in my hands and my feet since I was 15. And that is the same pattern that was my grandfather, my mother's father. He had arthritis in his hands and his feet when he was a teenager. It didn't really start spreading too much until he got into his mid-30s, and that was the same pattern for me. Um, Also, the interesting thing to note here is that I have a five-fold higher risk for what's called Fuchs corneal dystrophy. And it's a corneal disorder in an inner layer, a middle layer of the cornea, where it's dry. And it's unusually dry. The water pumps that are in that layer of the cornea are not working properly. And the treatment for it is actually quite simple. It's a saline eye drop that I do twice a day. Some people do once a day, but it kind of forces those water pumps to work. The symptoms that I had for Fuchs was that I was having blurry vision. I might go get an eye test, get a pair of glasses, try them on, and they were fuzzy. And I'm like, wait a minute, I just did an eye test. Why are my glasses fuzzy? Well, they weren't. It wasn't the frames and the lenses. It was me. And so my vision, I do have vision problems. I have more vision problems when I'm tired. I have more vision problems at night, and I do have fuzzy vision sometimes during the day based on how the cornea is working and processing water. So I took this, I asked my doctor when she diagnosed me with Fuchs corneal dystrophy, my eye doctor. This was many years ago, probably 5 years ago. And I asked her, I said, is this something that's inherited? Because I thought maybe my brother or sister are at risk for this. And she says, well, there's no evidence that I know of to suggest that it's inherited. And she said, though, that one thing that was really important is that if you have Fuchs corneal dystrophy, you do not want to have LASIK, because LASIK, they cut into your cornea and laser into your cornea, and you don't want to have LASIK. And I knew that both my brother and my sister had LASIK surgery. So I went back and I started doing some research. And at about the same time that I was researching this, my result came in, and on the list was Fuchs corneal dystrophy. So I did actually go back to my eye doctor. I brought this. I printed out all the information online from the .gov websites, and I took it to her and I said, look, there is an inherited tendency here, at least for me. So it's something that that I know that she's incorporated back into her practice, because she didn't know that. So I was able to at least teach her a little bit too. Let me back up just 1 minute, because at the very bottom of this list, Coumadin resistance. I was going to mention this because I mentioned it when I was in Westchester doing the presentation. My husband recently had open heart surgery, and he had his second valve put into his heart. And it's an artificial valve, and that requires Coumadin. And before we did that, because I noticed with my health report that I had Coumadin resistance in my health report, so it would make managing the INR level, or the clotting factors, difficult for me if I had to take Coumadin. I thought it was important that we determine that before his surgery. So we uploaded his raw DNA results from Ancestry to Promethease to see if he had Coumadin resistance, and he did not. So he went ahead with the artificial valve. But if you didn't know that, Coumadin is a lifelong consequence of having an artificial valve. And so every week or 2 weeks, or sometimes it can be longer spans, you have a blood test, you determine your clotting factors, you modify what you're eating, or you take a little bit more medication or a little bit less. Because if your blood is too thin or too thick, it's a problem. It can be a problem either way, stroke or clotting. So it's important for that to be very, very well managed. So it's also important to probably know if you have Coumadin resistance. 23andMe does give a lot of information about some very specific genetic health risks. Again, I would say this is not a diagnosis. You should go to your physician. But some of these things, if you have these conditions, you might recognize in your results. There's a list here, and I won't go through all of these, but I think that's interesting to understand that there are a lot of different things that have been studied for many, many years. There are things that have been studied in different ethnic populations. You'll see that some of these have to do with European descent. There are other things that have to do with Ashkenazi Jew or North African descent, or any number of other ethnic groups. So it's important to always kind of read all the fine print and learn what you can, and also go back to find a doctor who knows and can interpret this. It's important to know too what the testing company is not going to test. I think that's just as important as knowing what they will test. There are some adult onset diseases that may not be tested by the testing company. There are cancers, diabetes, heart disease, and things that come as a result of growing older. Our bodies tend to break down. We're not as efficient. There are a lot of factors environmentally, maybe diet related, that can cause late adult onset diseases. There may or may not be a genetic trigger, but for example, we probably all know people who were young and got diagnosed with something like lung cancer but never smoked in their life. And then we know other people, like in my family, that might have smoked their entire life and lived to be almost 100 and never had lung cancer. So, a lot of this has to do with environment, triggers, carrier status, and whether or not you have alleles from both parents, variants. So there's a lot at play here. There are risks for some hereditary cancers that are not tested. There are lots of kinds of breast cancer and ovarian cancer syndromes, hereditary colon cancer syndrome. There are lots of things that scientists are still researching, of course, but it's not as cut and dry as I have the BRCA gene or I do not. There are lots of different kinds of breast cancer. And there is an area of science where people are actually studying why cancer might show up in one particular region versus another that may just have to do with a weakness in your body somewhere. And kind of like the disease settles at the weakest point or manifests at the weakest point. So there's some things that are still being discovered and studied every day. So stay tuned for some of these, but don't look at your results and say, well, I don't have to go get a mammogram anymore because BRCA gene isn't on there. That's not true. Certain drug responses have not been part of this testing. Some have, some have not. But that, I think, is going to be probably one of the largest areas that expands in the future is pharmaceutical DNA research. And I think that's going to really take us by surprise. We all know people that have certain health conditions, and maybe they're on a lot of different medications and there's a lot of drug interaction, and actually the drugs end up being maybe part of the problem or the biggest part of the problem. So I think it's really important that we learn how drugs individually interact in our body. And just like I have a problem with NSAIDs, I think it's important for each of us to know if we have a drug allergy or a poor drug response. Mosaicism is not tested. It's not something that's going to be revealed by your DNA test. If you're mosaic or chimeric, you have 2 or more DNA profiles within your body. There are a number of ways this can happen. Most of us, the vast majority of us, would not have this. If you are a mosaic or chimeric, you probably already know at this point in your adult life. But mosaics can happen, or at least mosaic DNA lines can happen too if you have stem cell transplant or some other instance where another person's DNA is introduced into your body, and then those cells begin to divide. And so you have 2 DNA profiles. It also, mosaicism happens when in utero, when one twin absorbs another twin. So it wouldn't happen with identical twins because that would be a twin absorbing identical DNA. But if you have fraternal twins and one twin doesn't make it and it's absorbed by the second twin, sometimes you can have 2 lines that develop there. It's a rare thing, so you probably shouldn't be thinking, hey, that's me. It's a rare thing. but it's not something that the testing company can really tell you you have. Also, there are a number of variations and diseases that show up on what's called copy number variations. So if you know about Down syndrome, the common form, probably the most common form of Down syndrome is trisomy 21, which is having 3 copies of chromosome 21. The testing company is not going to be able to tell you that you have 3 21s as opposed to the normal 2 21s. Klinefelter syndrome is another where some inherit 2 X's and a Y. So those are things that the testing company is not going to be able to differentiate as well. Also, if you have partial trisomies, if you have extra pieces of DNA, if you have repeats or insertions or deletions or translocations, we're going to talk about those different things in a minute. But if you have any of those kind of things, the DNA testing company is not going to be able to differentiate that in your test. Where can you find out more information? One of my favorite sites is Genetic Home Reference. It's a site that'll help you understand the conditions that you might find listed in your health report. It'll give you the name of the condition, some of the descriptions, the summary, how frequently it's found in the population. If there's any pattern of inheritance to it, other names, diagnosis, sources to read about it. This is what the Genetics Home Reference page says about Fuchs endothelial dystrophy or Fuchs corneal dystrophy. So it talks about the vision problem that sometimes you have, visual acuity problem. Sometimes you have sensitivity to bright light. So there's a lot of different things you can learn there. You also can learn about, when the onset is. It said it usually begins in someone's 40s or 50s. That's true for me. And then there are some variants that are early onset. Talks about solutions, treatments, and that sort of thing. So generally the treatment for it, should it get bad enough, is a corneal transplant. And that I might go my whole life and not need a corneal transplant. It just depends on how it plays out. But this is a great home reference where you can read all about it. You can learn where it is in the genome. You can learn about all the different symptoms and that sort of thing. 23andMe has a lot of information about wellness. How can DNA be part of your well-being, your lifestyle decisions? There are all kinds of things I've listed here. The one thing that I thought was interesting, a lot of these were interesting to me. Caffeine consumption. My results talked about how I was likely to consume more caffeine. That has to do with my metabolism of it. Caffeine doesn't necessarily work in the same way for me that it works for other people. So I just generally don't drink much caffeine because I don't get an extra boost for paying for a whole lot more Starbucks. Deep sleep is one that's interesting to me because I never really understood why I didn't sleep very long and why I didn't think I slept very deeply. I first, probably about 3 years ago, got one of those like Fitbit kind of wristbands to measure sleep because I've always been about a 6 hour a night girl, and just for a long, long time slept like that. And I thought, well, maybe this is, unusual. Maybe I should try to sleep more. Maybe I should try to change that. And it just seemed like if I slept a good 6 hours, I was good. I wake up, I'm awake. I don't even own an alarm clock. I get up at like 4 in the morning and boom, here you are. So, it's just an odd thing that's been around in my life for a long time. So I was curious about it. And when I did the wristband, I was able to figure out that I had very little deep sleep. I would deep sleep about 15 minutes a night, which is pretty unusual. So, so it did pan out on my health reports, and some information came out about that too. Um, Lactose intolerance, let me just mention, I am lactose intolerant. I'm allergic to dairy. I'm allergic to actually a lot of things, and dairy is one of them. Um, Let me also talk about sleep movement. I thought this was fascinating, and I've done all of their sleep studies and sleep surveys that they have at 23andMe because I'm just fascinated. I took a sleep psychology class in college. I just thought it was a fascinating topic. But I do not move when I sleep. I am in one spot and then I wake up and I don't move at all. And it's kind of a strange thing. But um, so I was interested in sleep movement. And of course, I married someone who has restless leg syndrome. So, he moves all the time. This is what the wellness report looks like. I just pulled this one off of my chart. Caffeine consumption, again, likely to consume more. That is, if I drank caffeine, it would take me more to kind of get to the point where a normal person might get with coffee or soda. Less likely to be a deep sleeper, definitely true. Predisposed to weigh about average. I would say yes and no. Average for me, average for my family. When I go back and I look at photographs, and I have photos of most lines of my family, it's the early 1900s, and some I have even further back than that. And I look at women who are in these pictures and they look like me. Their body type is like me. They're just chubby girls. And I'm thinking, in 1900, there wasn't all this refined sugar and snacks, and there was actual famine, and they worked on farms, and sometimes it was a good year and sometimes it wasn't. And I think there's just something genetically to that kind of set point. But again, like I said, I'd trade that any day to have longevity. So, um, lactose intolerant, it says here that I'm likely tolerant. I am not. I'm actually allergic to dairy. I have lactose intolerance as well. I think it's funny that my muscle composition came out as that I have something in common with elite power athletes, because anyone who knows me knows that I am, just about as coordinated as a weeble. So it just is not that. I mean, maybe the composition of my muscles is such that I could be an athlete, but I am not. Um, I also have here likely average or less movement in sleep. So some of these things, are more like parlor trick kind of things, but they are of interest because there are things that I see here that I think are really accurate. There are things that are a little bit on the edge. And then, of course, there are things that I think, well, I don't know how accurate that is. So just keep in mind, this is not a diagnosis. We need to talk for just a minute about affected versus carrier status. If you're affected, then you have a condition. So if there's something in your genetic code or in your genome where you have a gene for a disease and you're affected by that disease, you have that condition. If you're a carrier, you can possibly pass on the condition if your mate is also affected or a carrier. So there are some populations and some people who do genetic testing before they have children if they're in a specific population. The one that comes to mind for me is Tay-Sachs, which is common in Jewish population. And so when two people marry who are both Jewish, who might have had that condition in their family, it makes good sense to have a diagnosis and to have full genetic testing to determine whether or not you're a carrier, your potential mate is a carrier, and what the outcome of that could be. Um, Healthy protein development allows normal growth. And if you have a mutation in a gene that causes an error in protein generation, most of the time you will have what's called a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. So a lot of times there are pregnancies that don't go to term because there is a mutation in a gene or multiple genes, and that has to do with protein generation or some other vital function to life. And if you have a genetic disorder, then that's a condition that's caused by a mutation in one or more genes. So just kind of some terminology there to kind of wrap your head around what we're talking about. But let's talk about what kinds of mutations can happen. And this is a lot more, sciencey than maybe you want to know at this point, but I think it's an interesting thing because you can have mutations that are called insertions, deletions, duplications. There are a lot of different kinds of mutations. But I just have a couple of diagrams here, and it's going to take you a minute to probably study these and figure out what's happening. But let's look at this deletion mutation. The first, you can see where the first sequence starts with cat, 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 CAT. CAT is a code for an amino acid, histine. And so as it repeats CAT, 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 it's coding for histine, histine, histine. What happens is if a single base is removed, so if you move to the line below and the letter A is deleted from the sequence, so you no longer have CAT, 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 you have CT with no A in it, all of a sudden you're coding for a different protein. You're coding for CTC and ATC and then ATC and then ATC, and you're getting a whole nother set of amino acids that form. So sometimes having a mutation where you delete a single base can result in all the wrong protein being developed. And that oftentimes will lead to not having a viable pregnancy. You can also have an insertion. So if you look on the right, you have CAT, CAT, and you're coding for histine. But if you look below, CAT, 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 and all of a sudden an A is inserted, and you get ACA, and that's a different protein or a different amino acid. And then the sequence starts up again with TCA, TCA, TCA. You're getting different proteins coded just by having a deletion or an insertion of a single base in a single location. So it's something to keep in mind because what generally happens is that cell replicates and then it replicates and then it replicates. And so it's carrying that insertion or deletion along with it. And ultimately that could lead to a genetic disease, a disorder, or a non-viable pregnancy. There are a couple of other common mutations that can happen. A duplication. A piece of DNA is abnormally copied. So you can see in the diagram on the left is the chromosome initially that's being copied. And on the right, there's a chromosome, the same chromosome, but there's a section that's been repeated or duplicated in there. So that's something that happens. Also, there can be whole chunks that are deleted. So it's not just a single base pair. Lots of different varieties of things can happen here. There are a couple of different kinds of mutations that are interesting. One is called a missense mutation, where one base is substituted for another in error. And also what's called a nonsense mutation, where one base substitutes in for another, but then the cell stops building the protein. It just jumps in and it's kind of like hitting the stop button, and that will stop making whatever protein or whatever amino acid is supposed to be made there. So there are lots of different kinds of mutations. Some of them are critical, some of them are not. I mentioned that my father has blue eyes. I should have blue eyes according to the rules of dominance, but I don't. I have green eyes. It's a likely mutation. So it's just something to remember as you're moving forward. Lots of different science underlies why your health reports might say what they say. For carrier status, you can find out at 23andMe for a number of different carriers. But again, if you're making decisions about having children, passing things on, if it affects your children that haven't been born yet, you definitely want to consider genetic counseling. And there are genetic counselors in a lot of major cities, hospitals, children's hospitals, who do this kind of testing either before or after a child is born. And so it's important to go seek out an expert if you're concerned about being a carrier for something. On my genetic test report, what I saw a lot was variant not detected. Variant not detected means that you're not a carrier of the tested variant. However, there could be variants of the disease that aren't included in the testing company's tests. So it's important to remember that just because the variant is not detected doesn't mean you won't potentially develop or pass on a disease. It may just be that there's only one version of that particular thing that's been known to be at that location. Cystic fibrosis is a fairly common example of carrier status concern. Sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, and again, a lot of times ethnicity plays a role in this. Tay-Sachs is predominantly Jewish population. Sickle cell anemia is predominantly African American. So it's important to understand not only what could be carriers, but also if there's specific ethnic groups that are affected. This is the 23andMe carrier status report. This one is a screenshot of mine, and it talks about what does it mean. I love the fact that 23andMe does education along with results. I think that's really important. But you can see here there's a long list of things, and I don't even know what most of these things are, but variant not detected. So in effect, my children would likely not be at risk of that being passed on from me. But again, in order to know for certain, you would need to do a full panel of genetic tests, and also your spouse would be genetic tested as well, or your mate. 23andMe does have trait reports, and they're kind of interesting because some of them are kind of, gimmicky or just kind of parlor tricky, but I think they're kind of cool. Whether or not you have back hair or cheek dimples or what kind of earwax you have, things like that. Those are all genetic traits that we receive combination from mom and dad. So it's interesting when you look at some of this. I always joke about unibrow because my husband has a pretty defined brow from his German family, and I look back in pictures and I can always pick out who's who in the family pictures based on that. I call them the Edna Kaufman, his ancestor, Edna Kaufman's eyebrows. So, some of those things definitely are passed on generation to generation. I've included a snapshot here of the trait report. That's my trait report. And I've checked off all the things that are definitely true. And it's interesting, you see red hair, likely no red hair. I am a redhead. All my babies were redheads. So it's interesting that that's not there. And, there are some things like sweet versus salty, likely prefers salty. I actually don't prefer either. It's not that I don't like either one. I just don't have a preference one way or the other. I'm not one of those people always seeking out chocolate in the middle of the afternoon or anything. But it's interesting that that the DNA test that I say that I likely prefer salty. Likely no unibrow, so no unibrows in my family photos. In fact, you can't even see our brows because we're mostly redheads and we have, almost like albino brows and lashes. Eye color, likely blue or green eyes, so that was true. In my case, green. It talks about earwax, more than you ever wanted to know about earwax. So anyway, these are just some of the kind of traits that you'll see. And there are new things that post on here every once in a while. I've included some sources that are in your handout. 23andMe's website, Promethease.com's website. I didn't mention also, I talked about the test for 23andMe and the cost. The test at Promethease, it's not a test, you're actually uploading your raw DNA results. But your fee at Promethease is $5. And so it's a lot less in terms of cost, but there also is not all the other support in the citizen science piece of it. So it's just something to keep in mind if you really want to participate in future research. I did both. I did 23andMe and Promethease and just compared. And because they're using information from .gov sites, from government research, from the Human Genome Project, from all of our tax dollars that we spent on that. They're basically the same report. They're just in different formats and different interface. There's a link here for chromosome numbers with variants. I thought that was interesting. That's the chromosome number 4 that I showed you. There's one for each chromosome that lists all the potential diseases and things of interest or traits there. You know, the other thing that I didn't mention that you might want to consider, a lot of us do on GEDmatch segment analysis, and we might have a set of cousins and we might look at where we all have a segment in common. And let's say we all have a segment from a start and an end point on chromosome 15. It might be worth some investigation to find out if there are any traits or diseases or tendencies or carrier status information that apply to that specific location that you share with sets of your cousins. So that's kind of the next area where I'm kind of delving in, and I'm collecting up some cousins and do a combination segment analysis and look at potential health information as well. I also included a link for the U.S. Department of Energy Genomic Science Program. They have some great information, some great diagrams, and then again, one of my favorite sites, that Genetics Home Reference site, which is also from the National Institutes of Health.gov site. This is also where someone usually asks me about, you know, the advertisements you see online about tailored diet programs, tailored health programs, that sort of thing. I see those pop up all the time online. And I'm a little bit skeptical of those still. I think there's enough information in what you get at 23andMe and Promethease to take to your doctor to have some of those discussions. I'm not sure we're at the point where we can pay a company to analyze what we should or shouldn't eat every day at that kind of a micro level. I'm not sure. I haven't tried it yet. I haven't been willing to really put my genealogy and DNA dollars in that direction. So I'm not going to endorse or say otherwise, but I'm not sure science is at that point yet, but maybe soon. So stay tuned. So thanks for joining in today. Again, if you're not on Kathy's DNA list for the Southwest Ohio DNA Interest Group, please contact her through the website and let her know that you'd like to be on the distribution list. And if you'd like to be added to the Central Ohio DNA Interest Group through Franklin County Genealogical and Historical Society, you can also contact Kathy, or you can contact me, Kelli Bergheimer, and I'll add you to that list as well. And thanks again for joining us today.